So for whatever reason, they're giving us a truncated piece of information and assuming that the reader or the listener knows the rest of the story. Well, we don't. That's the problem. The Hebrew writers are not borrowing anything. They're part of the same conceptual world, the same cognitive environment. While the ties between the Apkallu and the
Mhm.
Nephilim are hardly ties that bind, there are enough points of comparison. Superhuman, semi-divine beings. And you were thinking, who are these Apkallu and what's the big deal?
And if Mark came first and chose not to record the resurrection, but left the women afraid in an empty tomb, what have you done? You've just undercut the authority of Matthew, Luke, and John, who proclaim the resurrection.
It's that archaeology is validating what the scriptures are telling us.
Alec, the Bible only has one message. It's only one message. It's how the Lord is going to conquer death to give us life. That's it.
Welcome to Water into Wine, where we study Scripture within its original context for the edification of the body of Messiah. Today, I'm joined once again by Dr. Mark Chavalas. Dr. Chavalas is a scholar, archaeologist, author with expertise in ancient Near Eastern history. He is also co-host of the Buried Bible podcast, where he explores the history and culture of the biblical world. I've asked him to join us again today to explore the historical background of Genesis 6 and its relationship to ancient Mesopotamian traditions. Welcome, Dr. Chavalas.
Yeah, it's nice to be here again. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your time with us. So basically, my first question is, we read in Genesis 6 about the sons of God and taking the daughters of men, and born of them is Nephilim, but we don't really get context to what exactly we're talking about there. And I believe some Mesopotamian scholars seem to think they have some connections, and I was going to explore that with you.
Well, yeah, that's very true. And I think that in looking at passage, I pretty much ignored the passage myself for years. And the first person who tried, well, first of all, the connection itself, throughout church tradition, especially since probably Augustine in the 5th century, has looked at this more from an earthly perspective. And perhaps he was a little embarrassed, especially in interacting with the pagans, who talk about the fact that, there might have been semi-divine beings here that were interacting with humans and creating an interbreed race of beings, which of course sounds a little like, even ancient Greek mythology has a little bit of things like this. And so from the 5th century on, traditionally it was looked upon as the sons of God as being heroic type men, or a particular genealogical line, either the line of Cain or the line of Seth, mixing together or not mixing together, depending on your point of view. And then, of course, it really is very abrupt. It's sort of preparatory for the flood, and you're thinking, all right, why is this here? It seems like a truncated piece of information. And of course, everyone knew that both Second Peter and Jude seem to allude to it, but it talks about angels coming down and cohabiting, which of course looks a little embarrassing from that standpoint. So what do we do with this? Now I have to admit that there are a lot of puzzle pieces that were simply not put together at this point. So, for example, the ancient Greek period writer Berossus, who was a Babylonian priest, in his Babyloniaca, which, by the way, did not survive, but through fragments in Josephus and other writers, he recounts a little bit about Mesopotamian history. And let me see if I can find the fragment of the text that I wanted to look at here.
Okay.
Let's see, where did he go?
So
All right. This is a text from Stanley Burstein's text on Berossus, which, by the way, he was one of my teachers at UCLA. I had a couple courses from him, and I drove him, though he was a classical scholar, I drove him nuts asking him all these Mesopotamia questions when I was
Right.
a beginning graduate student. Well, in the text, it talks about, this is in section 5. In the first year, a beast named Oannes appeared from the sea in a place adjacent to Babylonia. Its entire body was out of a fish, but with a human head grown beneath the head of a fish, and human feet likewise had grown a tail. And then he talks about the fact that the beast spent the days with the men, but ate no food. It gave men knowledge of letters and sciences and crafts of all types, taught them how to found cities, establish temples, introduce laws, and measure land. And then after a while, it went back into the sea and spent nights into the deep.
And
Yes, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, so that was from a Babylonian priest, you said?
Yes, Berossus, who's writing in Greek in the 3rd century. He's kind of like the Babylonian version of really, in many respects, like Josephus. You think about it, Josephus, here's a Jewish man writing in Greek for a classical audience to understand his own people. And Berossus is doing that. His work did not survive except in excerpts in other authors, including Josephus and a few other early Christian writers.
Okay.
And usually they're quoting him to refute him.
Okay.
But he has these fragments. By the way, he even mentions the flood story and other things. And so they've always been known.
Right. And so what he's talking about there with this beast, is he placing that as a historical event of civilization building? And is that pre or post flood in his account? Do we know?
This would be pre-flood.
Okay.
If from their standpoint, this is before the flood events themselves.
Okay.
So that's one fragment that had always been known to classical scholars. Berossus, of course, never really made the hit parade for early church writers or even a classical education. You certainly weren't. You would, if you're reading excerpts of Josephus, you might know about this person, but he's really, really obscure.
Okay.
Then, of course, we have the pseudepigraphal writings, and you think of the book of First Enoch, which also talks about what are called watchers, who are individuals. And of course, Jude quotes First Enoch. By the way, this does not make First Enoch authoritative, but it does make it a very important text. It's also pre-Christian, and it talks about. It also talks about the watchers who have come down. And so, in other words, First Enoch, I suppose you could say, is a very detailed commentary on Genesis 6. And explaining the fact that these beings are heavenly beings who have come down and interacted and impregnated human women to create a race of beings. You mentioned when we were discussing this before, Mike Heiser, and I think Mike Heiser is right about the Nephilim, probably a term that is from an Aramaic root talking about giants. And of course, the Septuagint translates it giants. Which of course does make a lot of sense. They're talked about later on in other places, connecting them with the Anakim and other folk that are interacting in the land of Canaan that have to be driven out. But the writer, both in Genesis and in early portions of the Torah and in Genesis 6, assumes that you know about this story, and so they're not leading up to it. And I sort of take it like if I'm talking to you about something about the American government, and I mention the name Uncle Sam, and I keep on saying that Uncle Sam took my money this week or whatever. You and I are going to understand this because of our cultural, background. Oh, he's talking about or if I just mention the term White House or I mention the World Cup,
Yeah.
whatever, because of our context, I don't need to explain anything else to you because I'm assuming that you haven't fallen asleep for 20 years. So you know all about it. Um,
Right.
you know, so for whatever reason, they're giving us a truncated piece of information and assuming that the reader or the listener knows the rest of the story. Well, we don't. That's the problem.
Hmm.
So and of course in First Enoch, which I'm not going to read right now, but when you look at the Enoch text for chapter 6 and following it, it goes into great detail about these angelic beings or heavenly beings who have come down, and like the Berossus story, they impart civilization to human beings, but they also go to the dark side, and that's the issue. So with these pieces and fragments of information, now we delve into Mesopotamia. And by the way, by going into Mesopotamia, nothing is readily apparent. I think the first person who tried to make a connection between Mesopotamian sources, not just the Berossus story, but the cuneiform material that talk about beings that are semi-human, semi-divine, that impart civilization to humans, but also are irritants to humans. The first one, I think, seems to have been Am Draftcorn Kilmer. She wrote an article in the late 80s, which was in a pretty obscure. Basically, it was a volume to honor Francis Anderson, and so it's really hard to find. But I'll put it up here. Hopefully you can see it. I can't see myself, and so I'm.
Yeah. It looks like, yeah, I can see that.
Okay, great. Well, in any event, the Mesopotamian counterparts of the biblical Nephilim is her article, and in her notes. I'm going to read what she says here. Several of my Berkeley graduate students have written very thoughtful and useful assigned term papers on the topic of the Apkallu, who are the heavenly beings that we're going to be talking about in a minute.
Okay.
And she gives the years as early as 1964. And she was a professor at UC Berkeley, and I got to know her. She's very, very sweet.
Okay.
Unfortunately, she just passed away about maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay.
And she said that most of the students, when they talked about the Apkallu, they were not interested in making the connections with the Nephilim at all. And so she says, while they recognize certain similarities, they rejected the connections that are suggested here by me. And so she writes this article. And before I get to the text, I want to summarize what she says here. I'm on page 43. It's only a 5-page article, and so it's very brief. This was
Okay.
like a review article. She says, in short, we may be able to look at Mesopotamian sage traditions for the mythological background of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. While the ties between the Apkallu, and I haven't even explained who they are yet, I know, and the Nephilim are hardly ties that bind, there are enough points of comparison. Superhuman semi-divine beings, acts of daring / hubris, acts that anger divinity, association with wickedness in men that predominantly in their predominantly pre-flood existence to encourage our consideration. And then she's done. And we were thinking, who are these Apkallu and what's the big deal? And
Right.
all I'm going to tell you is that there is no full, consistent Apkallu tradition. There are dozens and dozens of puzzle pieces that Mesopotamian scholars have put together, but they do not have a consistent Apkallu tradition. Although I have to tell you, about a couple of years ago, I ran across a book by a young scholar, Josephine Fechner, wrote this massive volume, 600 pages, almost In Search of the Seven Sages of Mesopotamia. And the seven sages are Apkallu, and she goes primarily in discussing how can you write a 600-page book like this? Well, a great amount of it is iconographic in form. In other words, when she sees 7 fish heads together with human bodies, together. She equates them with Apkallu. There's usually 7. It's kind of like the 7 against thieves in classical mythology. And you know how many pages she uses to talk about the biblical connection? 3.
Oh, wow.
It's almost as an aside. Oh, by the way, this is probably connected. In other words, the biblical tradition is probably connected to this. The Apkallu, it's a Sumerian word, by the way, Abgal. It's what is called a Diri compound, which means that the two cuneiform signs together make a whole, but separately they are meaningless. That's all I'm going to say about a Diri compound. And so we don't know what the etymology of the term is. It's usually equated with something about wise sages, and so we find it in Sumerian texts as early as the mid-3rd millennium, and basically, usually the first evidences of the term are secular sages. In other words, wise men.
Right.
Okay, or administrators who are important or what have you. And so it seems to be then when we start looking at Sumerian literature, we begin to see them mentioned, but they're never the main character in any of the epics that we have. Okay, so in other words, there's no famous Apkallu epic. There might have been. The most famous of these Apkallu is and we only know this through about 2 or 3 different stages, is someone named Adapa. And we do have 1 or 2 myths about Adapa. Adapa is a semi-divine creature who is angered by the gods because one of his boats capsizes. He fights against the gods, gets some help from Ea, and is banished from the heavenly realm, and the Apkallu evidently are ultimately banished too. But we'll get to that. So we have this Adapa figure, but to try to understand a consensus as to what the Apkallu are or were is virtually impossible right now. We have fragments of text, and so I'm going to look at a couple of them just to show you. In fact,
Okay.
This is actually an incantation ritual. So what? An incantation ritual, it just happens to in other words, and as usual, especially in Mesopotamian history, the writers are not interested in answering the questions I have. So if my question is, who are the Apkallu? It's kind of like writing about the Genesis 6 text. If your question is, who are the Nephilim, you're not going to get the answer directly.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the answer. It's kind of like when I would teach a course on women in the ancient world. None of my texts are interested in my question or my course. So we have to try to draw this information out, kind of like, intellectual blood from a turnip or whatever the phrase is.
Right.
So here's an incantation. It says antediluvian Apkallu. So these are Apkallu before the flood. And then it gives their name. I'll mention a couple of them. Uana, who completed the plans of heaven and earth. Uanaduga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. Enmeduga, these are nice Sumerian names if you're looking for a name for a dog or what have you. Who was allotted a good fate. Enmegalama, who was born in a house. That's a pretty important one, I guess. Enmebeluga, who grew up on pasture land. Anenlilda, the exorcist of Eridu. And then it says Utu Abzu, who in other places we know is Adapa himself, who ascended into heaven. And then it says total 7 brilliant Purudu fish, born in the river, who direct the plans of heaven and earth. And then it changes and talks about those who are born after the flood. And it says Nungal Piragaldim, who brought down Ishtar from heaven and who made the harp decorated with bronze lapis. Piragal Nungal, who angered Adad. Piragal Abzu, who angered Ea. Lunana, who is only 2/3 Apkallu. And of course, so the assumption is if you're only 2/3 Apkallu, what's the rest of you?
Mhm.
perhaps human, who
Mhm.
drove the dragon from Ishtar's temple. Then it says total four of human descent, whom Ea endowed with comprehensive intelligence. And so, of course, technically speaking, who are the Nephilim? The Nephilim are the descendants of the union, so they're these human hybrids. And so, at least the principle is the same here. This is not a hard and fast one-to-one connection at all. In fact, and Kilmer makes that quite clear, is that in order to make this connection, you have to draw in Genesis 6, Jude, 2 Peter, Berossus, the Enoch text, and then fragments of Mesopotamian texts that talk about this. And then the guess is that the biblical writer understands this tradition in the same way that he understands the flood traditions of Mesopotamia, in the same way he understands the traditions about temple building in Mesopotamia and the supremacy of Babylon, which seems to be discussed in Genesis 10 with the Babel story, and of course even creation accounts, etc. That they're well aware of this. By the way, as I've said before, is that the Hebrew writers are not borrowing anything. They're part of the same conceptual world, the same cognitive environment, as my colleague John Walton has said, is that they're sharing the same intellectual space. They are responding to it in a vastly different way, but the skeletal structure is similar. By the way, with this incantation, the whole point of this incantation is actually to speak against these beings. And so
Okay.
it continues on. And so that's sort of the weird part. By the way, another person who's taken a look at this relatively recently is Amor Anus in another article in a pretty obscure journal for the study of the pseudepigrapha, on the origin of the Watchers, a comparative study. And so he also makes this connection in a very long, detailed article. In fact, I think Mike Heiser in his Reversing Hermon makes reference to this work too. So
Yeah.
Mike, who I think the beauty of what Mike did there was to put this in a way that is understandable for an interested public. And so what my goal is, of course, is to try to go back into the weeds and look at it from a Mesopotamian perspective. In fact, when I was alerted to Mike's work, I looked at it and said, well, that's all well and good, but since I'm a Mesopotamian person, let me go live into the weeds and start studying these connections myself. And and I'm at this point pleasantly surprised by the fact that it seems to work
Okay.
from that standpoint. There are a few other texts that are fragmentary, and so
Okay.
and
There's one thing.
yes, go ahead.
One thing I just wanted to mention. So we have, from what you've read and alluded to, so you have traditions, the Israelite tradition, but you mentioned it sounds similar to Greek mythology or Mesopotamian mythology.
Yes,
Not exactly one to one, but we do have some very common threads and ideas across different cultures. One thing that I think puts off, say, the Christians often when they're reading and trying to look into this is something, I think it was the Kilmer article, you said something about the myth. And I think then they think right away, oh, they're saying the Bible's a myth. Like, does that make sense what I'm saying there? And I think
yes.
that kind of throws them off, and it might make them not even want to pursue it if they start. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that's because the term myth has gotten a bad press, and I understand it quite well. It certainly gets a bad press, even in the writings of Peter and others, because, and of course, they're purpose there is to react against pagan traditions. And so, by the way, the term mythos just means narrative in Greek. And
Okay.
so, and more particularly, it's a narrative in a sense concerning cosmic history, primeval history. And so this is a way to explain the nature of the world, the nature of the universe. And so if you look at it from that generic standpoint, it's not the difference between myth and history. They're not polar opposites from that standpoint. It's not like, well, history on the right hand is true, myth on the left hand is false. That's not the point at all, because of course, if you think of the biblical text, certainly they're dealing with history, but it's a theological reflection on a known history. So they're not giving you comprehensive information anywhere, really, from Genesis all the way to 2 Kings. The goal of the writer is not to give you a comprehensive history of Israel, which you should already know, you good Israelite. But what they're giving you, in my opinion, is reflections on our history that will understand our present situation, which of course is extremely traumatic. We just lost our temple, our city, our sacrificial system, and we've been deported, and our land is a waste. Now let's go back into our history and try to understand it. And we'll do it by looking at significant points along the way, but not all of them, and we don't give you details about all of them because they're already known. Here we are 2,500 years later, and we're saying, well, we don't even know what the original details were. Can't you help? And by the way, that's what my job is, or someone like me, is to try to fill in those details. And often the only way to fill them is by looking at ancient Near Eastern environment and context to see, all right, this is what the world was like. This is what they're probably alluding to.
Okay.
That's what I do, by the way, with my podcast. And so I think the same thing is going on here, is that, well, now I lost my point. What was the original?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you were, I think you were looking up some more fragments that
Yes.
we were going through.
Well, for example, so back to the term myth. Myth is a way to explain, cosmic existence. And so and I know that since myth has gotten a bad press, it's an unpleasant term to use. But if I use the term Old Testament and myth, what I'm simply saying is the way to explain its reality. It has no bearing on historical or accuracy or lack thereof, in the same way that when the Bible is talking about history, again, it's giving you a theological reflection upon history, which is incomplete by definition, and it's also theological. In other words, you think about it, we can be certain that since we have an Assyrian account of the invasion of their siege of Jerusalem, and we have a Jewish account of the siege of Jerusalem, that the siege of Jerusalem most certainly happened. Okay. But both sides give vastly different perspectives on it, understandably. The Jews, of course, are saying, well, we know exactly what happened, and we know why it happened. It was God that did this. And so it emphasizes the fact that God delivered us from them. And it emphasizes these positive things. The Assyrians, of course, emphasize things that are positive to them. We went and did what we wanted. We had no interest in, finalizing the siege. I suppose it's kind of like looking at the current war with U.S. and Iran. And of course, both sides are going to explain things in the best way possible for their public. And of course, we might call this propaganda. And what's propaganda? It's not false. It's a way to convince you of a particular truth by using certain facts. Mm-hmm. We, of course, look at the Bible as authoritative. And so when they're doing it for altruistic reasons and for the best way possible to draw you into true belief and true faith.
Hmm.
So because of that, as a Near Eastern scholar who's also a Christian, I do not make a large divide between myth and history as if they're two separate entities. I wrote a little article on this when I was first starting out about 40 years ago in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, simply called, the Historian and the Believer, and something. I don't know what the title was, but something like that. About
Okay.
1993 or thereabouts. If somebody wants to go fiddle with it, so I guess 30 some years ago.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful, I think, for a lot of people that are like the average Christian who's coming in and trying to learn a bit more context. I think that can be a stumbling block. So I think that's really good
Yes,
information.
and it doesn't. This does not negate what Peter says, because the contexts are different. Because it's one thing for me to say, when the Greeks talk about Zeus and all this, it's ultimately without authority. It doesn't mean there's no truth value to it. It means that it's ultimately lacking authority and it's ultimately false. The biblical text is the authority that I use and that I've put my life under.
Hmm.
And so it's not 100% false, 100% true. It's a different way of setting things up. And so I understand what Peter's saying there. And so he's using the term myth in a different way than I am, I suppose is the best way to look at it. So now, and sometimes, by the way, I know there are different terms, but sometimes, that we can whitewash and use the term epic if we like, just
Right.
if it makes somebody feel better, I suppose.
Yeah.
So here's a first. This is probably a early first millennium Mesopotamian epic era, and Ishum, two divine beings, and in the middle of it, Marduk is being described, and he says, and this, by the way, this is just an anecdotal piece of information. I think it's in the first tablet. He says, as for the people who were left from the flood and saw the results of my action, should I raise my weapons and destroy the remnant? I made those original Apkallu go down to the Apsu, which is the deepest part of the underworld. We get the word abyss from it. And I told them not to come back. And then he describes a number of them, which are not unlike some of them. Then he says, "Were the seven sages of the Apsu, the holy?" Then he calls them holy carp, which is I think pretty funny, in English, who are perfect in lofty wisdom. And so, in other words, whoever they are, they've been sent to the underworld. And so, right now, the Apkallu are underworld beings. And of course, what does First Enoch say about the Watchers? They've been chained in the underworld. They were up here. They gave human beings civilization. They sort of messed things up. And of course, that's exactly the tradition that we have in Jude and to Peter.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very quite a connection, isn't it?
And then one or two other texts, and then I'll stop at this point. Let's see, Eric. In other words, that's simply an anecdotal situation. W.G. Lambert, a brilliant Mesopotamian scholar I met once or twice, had an article called The 21 Poultices. This is about 50 years ago, where he makes mention of these texts. This is a medical text. And again, the Apkallu are called upon. But again, this is an anecdotal piece of information. It says Numdimud, which is Ea's nickname or his first name, became angry and summoned the seven sages of Eridu. Now, it's interesting that they're now from Eridu, which, by the way, in Mesopotamia is the first city. It's probably equated with Irad in the Genesis account. Bring the document of my ownership. And he just talks about these beings. Another text in Uruk King List, Alan Lindsay writes that during the reign of each of the early kings in the Sumerian king list, they had an Apkallu with them And the first king, the first sage was Adapa. Then I won't read all the other ones, but some of them are already named with this. And we even have Gilgamesh mentioned in this point. In fact, Gilgamesh, by the way, seems though he's not an Apkallu, he has Apkallu with him. And by the way, at that point, they're simply earthly sages. And so the term is used. In other words, it's a catch-all term for sages. There are the heavenly sages, there are the mixed ones, and then there are earthly sages, and the term is used. And so how do I know who the Apkallu are? By context. But like I said before, they're never described in their own epic. There might have been one, but of course, our understanding of Sumero-Akkadian literature is pretty vast. If you put together all just Sumerian literature by itself, it's as big as the it's just about as big as the corpus of the Old Testament. And so it's actually, so in other words, we have as much Sumerian literature as we do Hebrew literature from the early periods. And Akkadian literature is much larger, by the way.
Okay, wow. And is it in cuneiform?
Oh, yes. So this is all, of course, in the cuneiform material that, by the way, has always been known, but decipherment did not occur until the late 1850s. And it was just as difficult and unpleasant as Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs, which was about 30 years before that. You had to have a key in order to do it. And so we had a trilingual text. The most famous one was the one at Behistun on a mountaintop in Iran that had to be copied by Rawlinson and others working with it. It still took them about a decade and a half before they were convinced that they could start understanding the cuneiform writing system and the connections. And so they began to understand Akkadian. They didn't even call it Akkadian at the beginning, but they called it Assyrian. This is why you call somebody who deals with cuneiform an Assyriologist, which is sort of a misnomer, but we're not going to change it now.
Right. So the cuneiform is the script, and within that script you can have variants in language. Is that?
Yes. But you think about it, that's no different than us writing. I mean, think about it. The alphabet that we use, it's not the English alphabet, it's the Latin alphabet, which is a derived from the Greek alphabet, which is derived from, alphabets from the Mediterranean, which by the way, now go back at least to the mid third millennium now. In other words, they've been pushed back about 500 years by texts from inland Syria.
Wow.
So the alphabet is much, much earlier than we thought. But so in other words, you can write. In fact, when I first started learning cuneiform, I started writing my name in cuneiform and trying to write English sentences in cuneiform because, of course, it was just doodling and it was fun. So in other words, a writing system and a language are not the same thing. You could write English in any script you want. I don't know why you would want to. And of course, it becomes rather obvious to anybody who does not have English as a first language that our script and our language don't correspond very well, because of course we have, what's the Bernard Shaw famous word GHOTI? He said, how do you pronounce GHOTI? And everyone would say something like goatee. And of course, his response was, no, it's fish. GH as in tough, O as in women, TI as in nation. You put them all together. And of course, it's nonsensical. The point was to show us that our language and our script don't match up very well, but we're quite used to it because we were born with it. And we found out, much to our shock, when we started learning our letters, that even the letter A has a couple different sounds to it. And how do I know which one is going to be used in a sentence? Well, it's because of the way the sentence is, or because of the way the word is. And so the cuneiform writing system was used for a multiplicity of languages very, very early, by the way. And so you've got, we look and right now the guess is Sumerian is probably the earliest cuneiform language, going back to at the very least the mid fourth millennium, maybe earlier. But Iran has what is called Proto-Elamite text, which is also a cuneiform base, but and the assumption is it might be a little bit later, but we might find out that it's not. It might be the reverse. We just don't know yet. But texts from Susa and elsewhere are very, very early. And Proto-Elamite supposedly has been deciphered recently, and it looks like it might be connected to later Elamite. But we have multiple languages being written. They're all unrelated, by the way. Akkadian, which of course is a Semitic language, distant related, maybe a great uncle to Hebrew, I suppose is one way to look at it, is found about a millennium later. By the mid third millennium, we begin to have what we would call Akkadian text. And it looks as if Sumerian and Akkadian are now interacting with each other, passing words back and forth. We call them loan words, but they're not really loan words because they're never given back. And we thought the Akkadians were borrowing all the words. In fact, that the term Apkallu is an Akkadian loan word, a loan word taken from Sumerian, Akkadianized. And of course, we understand this well, either taking words from other European languages or other languages taking words from English, because of course English has some new technological concept that they don't have, and so they have to take the word, lock, stock, and barrel, and then modify it to put it in their own language. I can't think of one right now, but they're easy to understand. So, but there are well over, there are literally over a dozen languages that were employed with the cuneiform writing system. But we can thank whoever invented the alphabetic system, because it's so much easier to work with. And ultimately, although it takes now over 2 millennia, it ultimately supersedes the cuneiform tradition. I suppose the cuneiform tradition can have the last laugh only because, when you discard a cuneiform tablet and it gets buried, or if you burn it, it lasts longer than a piece of animal skin or a papyrus fragment, etc., which are much difficult. So this is why we have found, roughly upwards to 1 million clay tablets have been uncovered, and that's just we're just at the beginning of it. There's 130 plus thousand just in the British Museum itself.
That's amazing.
That's a lifetime of research for people.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing also I was going to ask you, you mentioned that Amar Annis article, and I haven't got all the way through it. I had started reading that, and he seemed to draw a connection that he thought Apkallu to watcher, the terminology there. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, and he does that because of the Enoch text. Because of course, if you think about it, when you look at the book of Daniel, and I, tongue in cheek, by the way, that there's a brand new volume out on the first half of Daniel by Aubrey Buster and John Walton, which I encourage people to get. And the second half will be coming out, I think, at in November. But when you look at, if you're asking when was Daniel written, my answer is, Daniel has written early, and it's also written late. In other words, there's a stream of tradition which shows that we have early and late material in the text that has been mingled together in a way that is indistinguishable to us. And so if you ask me when was Daniel written by Daniel himself, well, that's a whole issue of authorship that maybe we can talk about some other time. But anyway, the Daniel text, the watchers are quite positive. The term watcher, it's like the word in English. It just means somebody who's, watching or guarding or looking out. And so The term watcher in Daniel has a very positive connotation. The term watcher in Enoch has a negative connotation. But they are clearly the ones who are mentioned as Nephilim in Genesis 6. And Anos has made this connection from Genesis 6 to the watchers in Enoch to the Apkallu traditions. And he understands this quite well, that this is a thread, that we might find another text in the future that will, completely dismantle this thread. But this is how you deal with anything in ancient history. Is right now I'm pretty certain about, this connection until tomorrow when I find something that undoes the connection that I had.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess you don't want to dig your heels in too deep there.
No, because usually what I find out is that somebody's already working on the next section that modifies this or makes my opinion obsolete, and so I want to make sure I'm humble, and I really try to have that spill over into biblical studies when I'm looking at a text and provide a strange interpretation of it. I might have to come back, a year or two later and say, well, never mind. I thought I was right, but I wasn't.
Right.
And so it just to me, it should force humility into somebody rather than certainty.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so then with these connections that we've looked at, connecting it to Genesis, is it safe to say that the ancients took more of that supernatural view of the sons of God, and that the tide sort of changed with Augustine and then after? Is that a safe conclusion, do you think, or was it always a mixed understanding? And maybe ultimately, does this context bring us any closer to an informed decision now?
Well, I think, and when I use Augustine, of course, I'm sort of using him as as one person. He's not the only one. Even a couple centuries before him, Origen. And by the way, I'm not an early church expert at all, and so I'm doing this, off the top of my head with trepidation.
Right.
But Origen and others, like I said, try to bring these beings down to earth in response to, I think, the classical traditions. And so I suppose you could say they're demythologizing them if you use it in the way that I expressed earlier in our talk. And I think the church ran with that since Augustine throughout the centuries. And so the traditional view, like I said, is either looking at this as an earthly line, sons of God, or the line of Adam, daughters of men, line of Cain. And it's the fact that they mixed was a bad thing. But that's not the conceptual world of the Israelites. And even the Israelites, the Jews during the time of Jesus, their conceptual world, the divine and human world, still intermingled. For us, I think it was an easy take in the scientific revolution age to keep them quite separate. It's one thing to have a miracle about God himself, or the fact that the miracle of the resurrection, etc. But for the divine and human worlds to continually sort of intermingle almost in a casual way, I suppose is uncomfortable for us. Even the strongest believer in the Western world, we've been trained to look at our universe in a very secular way. God is, he might be immanent when it comes to our personal life and how he interacts, but he's usually more or less transcendent when it comes to the working of the universe. At least this is the typical traditional way. This is sort of, even when we talk about the weather, it's cold outside. well, that sort of depersonalizes. But in Spanish, of course, you say hace frio, and of course, the subject is God. In other words, that's more like a pre-scientific revolution understanding of things. So it's really hard for us to enter into the ancient Near Eastern / Israelite conceptual world where where the natural and the supernatural elements are mingling together in a way that, like I said, makes us uncomfortable. And I think that's perhaps the issue here. And so when you understand that, then you put Genesis 6 back into that supernatural environment. Of course, then the next question is, well, what do I do with that? Do I run amok with it? Which, of course, has happened on the internet, as far as I can see. The one or two times that I brought up the Nephilim in my podcast, it exploded in views, and then it came back down to normal. Afterwards, I'm thinking, what's going on here? Why are people so obsessed with this? Is because they're obsessed with the supernatural world, and anything that makes that connection, excites them. But if you dig into the weeds, like I've tried to do, and I think it sobers you up. Now, what do I do with this passage? It tells me that I need to have the same type of worldview when I look at the Bible as the ancients do before I try to apply it in my own context. So when I realize, Genesis 6, the beginning is preparatory for the flood. So something's going on here, and God is now trying to purify the world from these supernatural beings. And of course, then we have this really weird statement about them being there before and after the flood.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that mean? They mean they weren't destroyed? Well, the answer is not given to us. And so, but of course, people don't like unanswered questions. And so they have to find the answers. My response is, no, I have to live with the tension of not knowing.
Right.
And so are the Nephilim, are they the demonic forces that are described in later Jewish tradition in Jesus' time? That's the connection. And of course, that's the connection that Mike Heiser made. And I think, what I really appreciated about Mike, and maybe I brought this up before with you, is that he took very, very difficult material. He went into the trenches in his own studies, and got beaten up for it, by the way, in conservative Christian elements, went on to graduate school in secular environments, worked through this material, and then brought it forth to an interested public. Well, nobody had ever done that before. And so this is what I really greatly appreciate with him. And so whenever he brought up a Mesopotamian element, then I would go into the field to say, all right, looks like he did his homework, and he did it well. And so I encourage people to read his books, either on demons or angels or the other works. They're actually not sensationalistic at all, and I think quite sober. In fact, in some respects, if you dig into them, they're sort of slow and drudging. If you start looking at the notes and start reading the material that he read, that's really slow reading. Like you're trudging through Amar Anas's work. That was not meant for a popular audience. That was meant for pointy-headed scholars. And so I applaud Mike for his efforts.
Okay, and that might lead into something or at least partially answering something I was going to ask, and that would be, for the interested audience, where can they dig in and try to get some accurate, good information on the topic?
Well, it depends on where somebody wants to go, because I'm going to bring this up again. This book, it's so thorough. I actually did a book review on it, and I did it for the Near East Archaeological Society Bulletin. I don't even know if it's out yet. But But I did an overview of the book, and then I said, well, for those interested, look to page 484 to 489 or whatever. That's where he talks about the biblical. She talks about the biblical connection. I mean, this is so thorough that it probably wouldn't be something useful for someone who simply has a casual interest into it. Okay, this was an ancient Near Eastern scholar writing for other ancient Near Eastern scholars.
Okay.
Here's the publisher, Ugarit Verlag, which of course is insanely popular with everyone. And of course, that's not true. So I suppose I would say I would go right to Mike Heiser's book, Reversing Hermon, is probably the best way to start, because he allows you to go as light or as deep as you want. And I think it is the third chapter, but you really have to read the first couple of chapters so he provides the context to understand where to put Genesis 6 in its proper environment. And of course, he expands it in a lot of other areas. But if you simply want to look at Genesis 6, look at his work, and then start studying his footnotes and look for them. That people can always contact me, and I can help you find. A lot of this material is not easily accessible. It's certainly true.
Okay. That's what I was also going to say is probably your podcast would be another place they could dig into some of this material and get in touch with you, I would think. Is that correct?
They certainly could. And I'm retired, but the biggest thing I wanted was to get emeritus status, not so much for the status, but because I have library privileges still. And so I can still get obscure materials sent to me through my library at the University of Wisconsin. Otherwise, I would be a lost ship on the sea without access. But yes, the goal of my podcast is really to break down biblical background material to try to help understand obscure passages, and sometimes passages that people never thought were obscure.
Right.
So that's the buried Bible.
Okay.
What it's called.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'll get links to your podcast. Is there anywhere else you want links or direction for the audience?
I think that'd be good. And anything. I mean, you know this quite well, but anything done by Mike Heiser in his Naked Bible, which is still out, and I think occasionally they'll republish or rebroadcast some of his lectures, but you simply click on Mike Heiser, Genesis 6. I'm sure that something will come up that will pique your interest. And the only difference between him and me is really one of specialty. He really entered into this he was a biblical studies expert seminarian who entered into the field of ancient Near Eastern history. I'm sort of the reverse. I went into the field as a specialist in Mesopotamia, but because of my Christian background, had an interest in biblical connections, and so I'm looking at it from we're here. I'm living on the Mississippi. We're on both sides of the Mississippi looking in. We pretty much see the same thing, but from different angles.
Okay, yeah, that's a nice compliment.
Yes, for him, yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today and sharing with us and directing the curious audience to the right sources, the tested sources to get to. I don't know if we get to the bottom of it, but
Not at all.
We sure get some more questions to ask.
Yes, if your viewers are interested in making comments, I'm always open to even responding on your website too.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
All the best. Thank you. It was a pleasure, Alec.